or humanitarian work or law or whatever, it should not be rocket science to say, excuse me, have you thought about the impact of this law in terms of women and men, or the needs on, just that basic, forget about all the broader issues around gender and identity. It's just, that's still missing at the receiving end. So I'm like, when do people learn this? Well, they should be learning it in academia. So that's one. Then I think about the kinds of issues around neocolonialism, and I think, well, what I see in the work that my partners are doing, and what a lot of the space that we have, is that it's almost like we need a course on social archaeology. And by that I mean like taking away layers and layers of colonialism and history and so forth that have hidden some of the indigenous cultural practices and norms, and bring that back up to say, women in Somalia, women in Kenya, or before British rule, how was land managed? Was there land ownership? Well, no, there used to be collective land ownership, and women and men had equal rights and so forth. And then the British came along and they, did divide and rule, and they imposed their way of doing inheritance, which, as we know from Jane Austen, is that the girls don't inherit anything, right? That's not the norm in a lot of countries, and yet it's been X number of years of colonialism, which then means we've forgotten the original history, the original roles. Now the colonialism is layered with Wahhabism in a lot of Muslim majority places, so it's very regressive. Teachings from Saudi Arabia has come in and actually completely drowned out indigenous sort of Muslim practices. And unless we can, in academic circles, we can talk about these issues and bring this out and teach students, or have a space where students can look at it from these different angles, I think that we're at risk of just completely erasing and being part of the erasure of that richness. So that's kind of definitely one aspect of it. Another aspect that I find interesting in academia is, or in kind of the way we look at these problems, is that there's a tendency to look at the problem, right? So and I say this to my colleagues. I say, there are lots of frameworks for conflict analysis in a country. What questions you ask, and what are the bad things that are going on. Why is it that we only look at problems? Why do we not also balance it out with looking at what works in a society or in a culture? And the example of that is, I say, if we did a conflict analysis, the same framework that we use for, if I go to Jamaica doing work on gangs, it's got this one-sided, what are all the bad things, and it looks like this festering place where there's violence and poverty and so forth. I could do that in Washington, and Washington could look like that, right? It's exact. You need to think, okay, there is these bad stuff, but what else? What else in this society is working? And that's a lot of the hidden aspects, and it's a lot of, again, where the sort of social relationships, kinship, women, etc. You see the ways culture has a role, and teaching that, I think, is another piece of the work. On the specifics of the sort of work around women, I had the luck in the early 2000s of doing the first piece of work on how women contribute to peace processes, and then I came to the States, and somebody said to me, do a report, and I said, we know there's nothing new unless we do research. And so they gave me a blank check. I was stupid. I didn't realize how much I should have asked for at the time. But design a multi-country study. And I said, we need to look at this in different countries. And so it became we talked to economists and statisticians to say, can it be quantitative? And it turned out that at the time it couldn't. It was hard to do that. So it ended up being a series of qualitative, almost like ethnographic studies. And the essence, the question that I was asking constantly was, okay, South Africa, how did women contribute to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? How did women contribute to security sector reform? And what I found over the years is that, again, this idea of people contributing, of what how are they positively engaged? How do they use strategies? How do they blend tradition, culture, faith, and law, and be very strategic in their engagement? These things need documentation, and they need to be taught. And yet it's not done. It's almost like, oh well, so and so in Cameroon is doing that. She's an anomaly, and it's this isn't the norm. And I'm saying, but no, it's happening everywhere. So there's something universal about it. Why do we not have the space to talk about these things? And I don't know whether that's Is it in anthropology? Is it in IR? Is it in political science? Where does it sit? I think it's interdisciplinary. I think it's fundamentally interdisciplinary. So that's why I love the program that you guys are starting to think about, because none of these things happens on its own. And if you only look at a problem through a legal lens, you really miss out. You can't get the reality. You know, we can have all the laws we want about what to do with conflict-related sexual violence. Trust me, the 99.999% of people who are raped will never see legal justice, and close to 100% of those who rape in a war zone will never see the inside of our courtroom. That's just the reality, it's a reality in England, let alone in DRC. So if we're thinking about trying to prevent or address these things, you need to think, what are the cultural dimensions? How do we broaden definitions of the law to say, or justice to say, okay, if someone's been raped and they've had a child, how do we move their lives beyond that moment of this horrific incident to say they need healthcare, they need education, they need opportunities to move on, the kid needs something, so it's using our academic spaces to widen and redefine and blend to make it more reflective of the reality out there.
Great, thank you. And I think, what the World Systems program is doing and the certificate is not just a space for engagement and thought and reflection, but they're providing and they're developing the pedagogical resources that we can all use in our teaching. And I think sort of the writings you're producing and the volumes that are forthcoming, I think that's why we need this intentionality and focus of the purpose of what we're trying to do. And so I very much agree with that. Thank you so much. I think, Mwage, maybe we can have time for questions. Do you want to oversee the Q&A?
Sure.
Yes.
Well, let's first start by thanking both Omar and Sanam for the wonderful conversation. And we'll open it up to questions. Yes. Please just say who you are so we get to know you.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm a graduate student here. And in relation to when you were talking about bringing more people than those who have guns to the table of negotiations and discussions about what's going to happen to resolve and reconstruct post-conflict, what mechanisms do you do to identify people who represent those populations, especially say women who are families and situations who a lot of the systems that are creating those conflicts are also actively working to keep them from creating communities and organizations that can identify against them.
Do you want to take a few questions and then answer? Do you want me to answer, or do you want to take a couple of questions?
Couple, is anybody along similar lines? Let's answer that one. So go ahead.
Sure, that's a really good question, and so the way that we've looked at it is to say there's no perfect answer, right? Because in most of these places you can't have elections. Although if you can have elections, that's one way. So for example, in Northern Ireland, back in the 90s, when Senator Mitchell went in to sort of help mediate, he had an advisor, and they looked around, and it was a woman advisor, and it's like, well, there are these major, there's the Catholic representative, and then there's the unionists, and but there are also smaller political parties, and how do we make sure that there's effective representation? They said, we'll have elections, and the top 10 political parties will have a seat at the formal table. At exactly that time, there had been a women's movement, a Catholic and Protestant cross community work group that was going on. And they looked around and they went and talked to the political parties to say, hey, will you take our issues up? And none of them would. And so they actually formed their own political party. It was called the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. And they had their own sort of stance on social justice, dialogue, human rights, and so forth. And in the space of 6 weeks, they campaigned, and they came 9th overall in the elections, and they got a seat at the table. And the major political parties despised them, and would moo when they went into the house, moo like cows, would start singing, Stand By Your Man, and all these things. And what the women ended up doing was they put a blackboard, and they started naming the men who were being rude. So it was like a naming and shaming game. But the importance that they had there was because they were Catholic and Protestant mixed, when things were really tense, they ended up doing a lot of the internal mediation, behind the scenes mediation, and weaving things together. So that was one thing. The other thing was that they were the only ones who brought up issues like, well, what's the education curricula going to look like? How are we going to teach our history? And what are we going to do about the police force? You know, when you have to have a new reformed police force. What about prison reform and things like that? So they broadened the discussions to not just be about what happened in 1685 and you know, how we all hate each other, but actually saying, what's the future that we need to go? What are the bread and butter issues of living in the future? So, and that's what we see a lot with women, that they're looking to the future and trying to sort of move things forward. In my work, we actually, when it came to the Syrian conflict, this question comes up all the time, you know, who's representative and so forth. And we did some research across multiple countries. We did a survey with over 1,000 Syrian activists. And it was amazing because the Syrian response and this global work kind of merged together. And it came down to, it was like, okay, imagine you want to have criteria, right? Let's say that we're not going to be able to have everybody represented. But you want, what are the criteria for being eligible for an inclusive enough process? And the criteria that came out were quite interesting. So one was, what are the values of the organization or these entities, these people that are, you know, are there values around nonviolence and engagement and human rights and so forth? Two, what kind of work are they doing? Is the work relevant to the issues that need to be talked about at the peace table, right? So if you're dealing with humanitarian issues and you have a humanitarian organization, you want them there, right? If you happen to be the Damascus Bicycling Club, maybe right now is not the right time for you, right? But it's like you sort of cull it in terms of, is there, if you're a local Yemeni organization that happens to do mediation across lines of conflict and is involved in some of the ceasefire issues, I think you want them there. Or the Mothers Association that has been negotiating the release of abductees, given that the issue of abductees is on the agenda and they've released over 1,000 people, you know, you'd want them present. So it's like, is the work that they're doing relevant and around the issues? And then there are other things, because in some places, like, well, how representative are they, and, you know, what are their membership, and, you know, we need trade unions. In Guatemala and in Northern Ireland and in South Africa, I think they had civil society forums, and they brought in trade unions, women's organizations, human rights organizations, and others, to be kind of connected to the process. What we've seen is that, again, if it should be more around the values and their approach, because you could have a, you know, mediation work or doing mediation and peace work in the middle of a very polarized war is dangerous work. It's not everybody wants to. So if you actually have a small organization that's doing that effectively, you may want, you know, you would want them there. You may want people who are working in regions, and so there are criteria around values, expertise or knowledge, and then sort of representativity, but also specificity. It's very doable, actually, to think about it like that. What's happened in the UN system is that they tend to sort of think about it in terms of, oh, well, you know, we'll put the women all in one room and they need to figure out their own stuff. And in the case of Syria, for example, there was a period where there were women who were members of Al-Nusra, one of the militant groups, and they were in the space with women's civil society groups, and you're like, you know, they have their representation elsewhere. I don't think that they necessarily, it's not just about being a woman, per se. I think the criteria should be based on the work and the values, and then broadening it out, because now we have a youth, peace, and security agenda, so there are young people who are saying, well, we want to have representation as well. So I mean, like, think about who's doing the peace work and who's on the ground addressing the conflict non-violently, or addressing the issues that have emerged out of the conflict, and have them present. And we have networks that know this stuff, so it's there's a whole ecosystem. So if they wanted to, they could you know, easily figure it out.
What you said about Western and some non-Western governments that can carry very colonial and Western sentiments, that brought to my mind how India, which has very strange but also very conflicted
it's interesting, and I don't know whether I'm going to answer your question as specifically as you want, but what we see constantly is that there's this binary, right, of poor women, vulnerable women, women as victims, and we must help them, right? And then there's this fascination with women fighters, right? So, the women who joined ISIS, the women who are,